Welcome everybody to our series of Sierra Club Community Conversations. I'm Steve Crowley. I'll be hosting tonight. And with us, we have a great lineup tonight with two people working hard on justice issues in our communities. Ashley Messier is with us, and James Lyall. We should have a terrific conversation. We'll probably be Ashley and James will probably be sharing the stage for the most of the first half, but at some point we'll shift over to a general conversation, and we welcome your input, your thoughts, your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Ashley. Welcome, Ashley.
Great. Thank you so much. Happy to be here. Just to give a little context to who I am and how I show up to this work. I am currently the executive director of the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative, which is a nonprofit in Burlington, Vermont, and I'm also the Vermont organizer for the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. I am a directly impacted individual, meaning that I myself was incarcerated at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility in South Burlington, Vermont. And so I really come to this work with varying personal and lived experience, and also educational and professional expertise as well. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation tonight and excited to see where it leads us. James, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. James Lyall. I'm the director at the ACLU of Vermont. Where, let's see, I've been here for just about 4 years now, just over 4 years. I was previously a staff attorney at the ACLU of Arizona for about 5 years in Tucson. And in the time that I've been here, criminal justice reform has been one of, if not our #1 top priority. And that this is work that the ACLU has done for a long time, but in 2018, we launched Smart Justice Vermont, part of the National ACLU's campaign for Smart Justice. It was, and I'm excited to share a little bit about that campaign and sort of where we are and where we're going. And it was actually through that campaign that I came to know and work with Ashley very closely here at ACLU, and continue to be colleagues in this work. So really happy to be here.
Great. I think that I'll get us started just by giving a little framework to what we'll be talking about tonight, and really how this applies to Vermont. And so, you know, as James said, the ACLU, I worked with them on the Smart Justice campaign when it launched, and really thinking about work that Vermont had done around justice issues and work that still needed to be done. And so, you know, over the course of the last couple years, there has been a lot of progress made, and there's still a really long way to go, right? And so things to highlight are really, you know, while Vermont seemingly has a small prison population in comparison to other states, it still, you know, has some problems, right? So for example, you know, Vermont has one of the highest racial disparities in our criminal justice system. We have hundreds of people who are simply incarcerated right now for lack of cash bail. We house people currently in our facilities on what's referred to as lack of residence, meaning that we're incarcerating folks simply because they have no housing. So there's really a myriad of issues that go from, you know, economic injustice to racial injustice and across the board. And Vermont is not exempt from, you know, the national context around all of those issues as well. And so, you know, I come to this work now from an abolitionist framework and versus a criminal justice reform framework. We believe that we can live in a community that does not rely on incarceration or imprisonment of our community members. We believe that there is a different way that harm can be responded to in a more successful way. I mean, essentially, if prison worked, nobody would be there, right? Prisons have been around for, you know, years and years and decades, and if prison was an effective deterrent or an effective behavioral management tool, right, no one essentially would be there in 2020. And so where I think people that work from a reform lens and people that work from an abolition lens really come together and come to agreement is that we need to be investing in our communities, investing in people, and not in, you know, new prison construction and further incarceration for our community members. James, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I mean, so the campaign that we're working on, the Smart Justice Vermont, and the national campaign is, you know, born out of a lot of the things that Ashley has mentioned. Vermont, as you said, has some of the worst racial disparities in the country. We have seen, just like other states, our prison population, although the numbers are small, the increase in the number of people incarcerated has ballooned over the last several decades. And, you know, through tough on crime mentalities and strategies and policies, they don't make a lot of sense. And, you know, as Ashley's describing, don't result in the kinds of outcomes that are promised or that our communities want. It's really a failed system that disproportionately impacts people of color, disproportionately impacts low-income communities. And so, you know, that's the impetus for the campaign, recognizing that the United States is the world's leading jailer, and that, you know, again, Vermont is not immune or exempt from these problems. Vermont, you know, in addition to, you know, the statistics and the numbers not being good, our Department of Corrections has been mired in scandal after scandal just over the past year or so alone. We saw a horrific sexual abuse scandal in Vermont's only women's prison, in a scandal that still hasn't been fully investigated or resolved. We've recently learned that of, you know, dozens of deaths over the last decade, none were properly investigated internally in violation of DOC policies. We, after calling for months for the Department of Corrections to test all Vermonters, all incarcerated Vermonters for COVID-19, that did not happen. We've seen a massive outbreak in the out-of-state prison population. Vermont sends hundreds of people to a private prison in Mississippi, where now, you know, 84% of them so far have tested positive for COVID-19. So, you know, in addition to the rapid and massive growth in incarceration, in addition to all of the horrific racial disparities, we also have a crisis of mismanagement and culture and failed oversight throughout DOC, and that extending also to the legislature, which is ultimately responsible for oversight of that agency and of a lot of these policies. And it's not happening. So just to add to some of the context that Ashley put out there, I mean, those are some of the problems that we are facing here in Vermont. And I think it's really important to underscore that Vermont is not immune from these problems. I think a lot of Vermonters like to think that we are different, that we are special, and that Vermont is not like everywhere else. And that may be true in some respects, but when it comes to criminal justice, when it comes to, that is not true.
And picking up on that context as well, I would say that, you know, while we as Vermonters are not exempt from these issues in our criminal legal system and in the way that our Department of Corrections oversees and manages its facilities and the people that it supervises and incarcerates, I would also say that Vermont is, however, uniquely positioned to address these things in a very different way. That I firmly believe that, you know, Vermont taxpayers and Vermont community members deserve the very best that our state government can provide them across the board, whether that's from education to safety to, you know, business opportunities. And currently we're sorely failing, you know, that the average taxpayer in Vermont by the mismanagement of these systems, by convincing community members that you are safer simply because these people are locked in cages facing, you know, sexual assault, inhumane treatment, lack of medical care, etc. And just factually, that's not true, right? We have decades of studies showing that incarceration does not equal accountability and change behavior, that it actually many times makes those things worse and can add, you know, a lot of people become entangled in the criminal legal system out of trauma. You know, specifically talking about the female population, which has been the subject of many of the controversies and issues going through DOC right now. You know, we know that upwards over 90% of the women incarcerated at CRCF right now are victims of trauma, abuse, human trafficking, substance use disorder across the board. And so, you know, incarceration in and of itself, especially in a facility like CRCF and under the current Department of Corrections system, is another form of trauma. And so when we look at return to facilities, you know, the Council on State Governments, while doing Justice Reinvestment 2 through the legislature and for Vermont over the last year and a half, looked at technical violations, which is the rate at which we reincarcerate people for things that are not new crimes. So simply not being where you're supposed to be, being late for curfew, maybe you smoked some weed and your PO didn't like it, whatever those, you know, technical reasons are, we have one of the highest rates in the country. And so we're continuing and perpetuating these cycles of trauma and abuse and state-sanctioned violence. And it's really not giving Vermont communities what they deserve, right? Safety is not simply because somebody's incarcerated and they get out and now they're safe, right? Safety comes from supporting your neighbors. It comes from supporting community. It comes from public education that is fruitful and robust. It comes from, you know, investing in communities so there's green spaces and there's opportunity and businesses can thrive. That's what we should be providing. And when we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars in corrections for nothing to be corrected and essentially for worse things to be perpetuated, that's increasingly problematic. And I think Vermont is uniquely positioned to do better, to provide its communities with the things that actually equal safety.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess just one other thing that I would add to sort of, I think we're laying out sort of the problem, and then, you know, I would like to speak a little bit to sort of what Ashley's getting at in terms of the opportunities that exist in Vermont and sort of, you know, what we're doing about it. And I think there is a lot of cause for optimism. But you know, Ashley, you mentioned medical care was just another thing that I didn't even mention. I mean, the ACLU has a pending class action lawsuit on behalf of hundreds of Vermont incarcerated Vermonters who are being denied life-saving medical treatment for hepatitis C simply because the state doesn't want to pay for it. You know, just as one other example, one other aspect of this problem where, you know, people in our prison system are not afforded the same level of dignity, respect, and humanity that everyone else is or should be. And I think a lot of what we're talking about stems from that, from just a failure to recognize and respect the humanity of other people, and a fundamentally punitive mindset that runs through our criminal justice system nationally, going back decades. The tough on crime era it's deep-rooted stuff. And even though our polling shows and extensive polling shows that the public is really moving away from that punitive mindset and recognizing the failures of the criminal justice system, unfortunately, I don't think our policymakers have caught up to the public yet. The politics of the criminal legal system is still, even though we are making great progress in ways that wouldn't have been imaginable even a couple of decades ago, there is still that kind of punitive framework and mindset. And we really need to shift to succeed on this campaign specifically and in general to advance a more just system. Part of it is about changing the hearts and minds and the framework from a punitive to a restorative model. But I mean, I guess I would also like, I mean, we can talk about the problems all day. But there is some cause for optimism, and as Ashley says, I think Vermont presents some real opportunities. And you know, just to give a couple examples of that, we've seen just in the last 6 months since we entered the COVID-19 era, we've seen Vermont's prison population, which was already decreasing from a peak about a decade ago of about 2,300 incarcerated Vermonters. It was already in decline in the period of a few months in the spring, we saw a further 20% reduction to the point that we were approaching a 40% reduction from peak. And the women's prison, looking at the women's prison, was cut in half in a matter of weeks, essentially. And how? By doing a lot of the things that people like Ashley and folks at the ACLU and other people around the state and around the country have been calling for a really long time. They were finally forced to do it, recognizing the extreme vulnerability of people in enclosed spaces, in institutions, to a pandemic. There was a new impetus to, all right, let's look and see who really needs to be in there. And let's do more to prevent people from being incarcerated when we don't actually need to do that. And they, by no means has the state done enough towards that, but simply by being smarter about who we send to prison, we saw almost overnight, I mean, in a matter of weeks and months, we saw a drastic reduction, hundreds fewer people incarcerated, when for year after year after year, the Department of Corrections and some of their supporters have said that that would have been impossible. There's no way you can do what the ACLU is talking about. And they were proven wrong almost overnight. And so that's really encouraging. And I think gives us, again, by doing some of the things that we've been calling for a long time and proving our point, I think gives us a roadmap to continue to build on those reductions and certainly make sure that we don't go backwards, but to continue progress forward in being smarter about how we bring the criminal legal system to bear when somebody causes harm. So, Ashley, I don't know if you have other thoughts on the good news side of things, but.
Yes, I do. I think, like I said before, I really think that there's a lot of potential, and I have faith, maybe misplaced at times, but I have faith that our legislature is starting to listen, right? Like, we have a citizen legislature. They are not experts on these matters. They're folks like you and I who show up to try to provide a service to our state, to active state government. And so it's really on those of us that are experts in this conversation and that do care about these issues, including if you're just listening at home right now to this conversation, you're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I support that. It's really on all of us to get involved, right, with our legislature and our elected officials to really talk about what we as Vermonters feel is important and how we want to see our communities and our community members treated, and how we want our communities to look and feel. And I think that that's important across many subject matters, not just in context of the criminal legal system. I would also say that in the sort of mass release we saw across the board, I didn't hear of any large crime sprees anywhere. I don't know if anybody else did. The reality is we did release people in large numbers. The prison population declined very rapidly, very quickly, and they were not supervised in the community the same way. So for many years, DOC and people that support the Department of Corrections have really fought us on, we have a very restrictive level of community supervision. And for many years, it's also a huge driver of our population numbers in the sense of those technical violations I spoke to earlier. And, we were told, oh, we have to do this intrusive, intensive, almost impossible level of community supervision when folks get out. We have to do that. We have to do that to keep communities safe. And that didn't happen. So because of COVID-19, folks had phone calls with their probation officers. There was very little in-person, supervision happening. And essentially things went okay. There's always going to be bumps in the road, no matter what we're talking about. But essentially, Vermont communities were not all of a sudden unsafe places to live and play with your children in your front yard. And so that also told us that the community supervision that has been such a point of contention for many years and a huge driver of our prison population is also not as needed as was claimed. And so I think that that's a positive realization as well, as we look to use, legislation that was passed for Justice Reinvestment 2 around starting to dismantle some of the forms of our community supervision and how we carry out community supervision. And so I think that that is another positive to speak to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess speaking of, justice reinvestment and community supervision, which is a big part of that. I don't know if it would be helpful to speak a little bit to sort of what's on the horizon in terms of legislative priorities and policies that we are working to advance. But just real quickly, from an ACLU standpoint, I can say that the Justice Reinvestment Law, this was signed into law by Governor Scott, I believe in July. It was actually, arguably the biggest legislative accomplishment of the year, and it got almost no attention. But as Ashley's been saying, the goal is to significantly reform and overhaul Vermont's highly punitive community supervision system. This is when people are placed on probation, parole, furlough, and revocation rates are through the roof. So JRI, as it's known, is now sort of entering the implementation phase, where we're really going to be pushing to, again, ensure that the lessons of the past several months stay learned, and that we don't resume a more punitive model of community supervision, that we do more to have an even less punitive, because I think Ashley can speak to the extent to which we can still do a lot more than even has been done up to this point to improve that system. Other big priorities for us just at the legislature, so that folks know, going back to the point about racial disparities being some of the worst in the country in Vermont, we do not have data to pinpoint or address or root out those racial disparities. And we've been calling on the legislature for years now, and not just us, but racial justice advocates and many others have been pointing out the fact that until we have system-wide data from not just police, but also from prosecutors, courts, DOC, and we have it on a regular basis where we can assess, who's entering the system and why, and what just so-called discretion points may be driving some of these racial disparities or geographic disparities or other disparities. Without the data, we can't really get at those problems. And so we continue to push for legislation that would require system-wide, essentially transparency. Other initiatives include sentencing reform. Increasing sentence lengths has been a major driver of mass incarceration nationally. The fact is the United States locks people up for much longer for essentially all crimes across the board than other countries. And the research shows that we have very much diminishing returns when the longer somebody is incarcerated. The rehabilitative effects, the benefits to society are diminished over time. Simply warehousing people is a huge waste of human potential as well as resources. So sentencing reform is slowly coming to Vermont. There's a long way to go on that. And again, getting away from the very punitive mindset behind these ever longer sentences is going to be really essential to dialing them back. So, those are some of the sort of policy priorities for the ACLU. Actually, I don't know if there are others that you can think of sort of either in this budget session or in the next biennium that come to mind. But again, those are JRI implementation, data collection, sentencing reform. Those are some of the things. Police reform is a whole other topic that we are very much deeply invested in. I could speak to that at great length, but
that's another show. That's another show, Jim.
Yeah, right.
I would say other policy areas for us that are important, along with definitely staying involved in current legislation and always sort of trying to push for a little bit more, is also, first of all, looking at the ability to use restorative justice in domestic and sexual violence cases. That's work I've continued to be a part of for quite a while now. We should be listening to victims. We should be listening to people that have experienced harm. And if somebody wants to use restorative process, that should be available to them. We should not be barring them from that opportunity. We should be providing people who have experienced harm with as many menu options as we can give them, right? For what's healing for them and what feels good and safe to them. And also this conversation about new prison construction. So when you heard James mention, you know, the COVID positive folks in Mississippi, where we have a private prison contract with Core Civic, who is notorious for anything you can think of. I would say that we continue to advocate against any new prison construction, whether it's specific to the women or across the board. When we have a Department of Corrections that, you know, Jim Baker said it himself to the Justice Oversight Committee that he can't go a meeting without having to talk about sexual misconduct in his in corrections. I think that we really need to deal with the culture and mismanagement and issues inside of DOC, because those will just follow us into new prison construction. And if we have millions of dollars to build new prisons, then we have millions of dollars to put into our communities to really address the underlying reasons that people get involved with the criminal legal system in the first place, which show better results, better rates of success, and more fruitful and thriving communities. I do want to know, I saw a couple of questions come up in the group chat, just because I do Zoom all the time. So I pay attention to the chat. I just wanted to mention the first one was really talking about alternatives. And so, you know, in this about, you know, if we have money to build a new prison, then we have money to invest in our communities, which is the same thing that the Smart Justice Campaign also believes: people, not prisons, investing in communities, in alternatives. Alternatives look like everything from providing adequate housing, providing mental health treatment, providing substance use disorder treatment, providing, you know, we level fund all of those things and have for years in Vermont, when there's more of a need now than ever, right, to have access. So when we think about children in our community, right, if a child goes to school, Vermont is amazing at this, right? We give those kids what we refer to as wrap services, right? We put a team of folks around them, teachers and guidance counselors and their family, and we have everybody sit at the table, and we get those children all of the services that they need to be successful, because we view children as redeemable and fixable and valuable. Well, just because someone is 21 or 29 or 32 does not mean that they're any less redeemable or any less valuable, right? And so this idea that we think about adults needing wrap services, adults needing support services. I have yet to meet a human being that doesn't need people, right? We have sayings like it takes a village to raise a child, and you know, your neighbors and your community, all of those are about people and connection. And so when we have folks struggling in our communities, the solution is really about how do we wrap them in services? How do we help them survive, prosper, heal? That's really where alternatives come from. It's about how do we create spaces, because Vermont is lacking across the board for mental health, substance use treatment. We need more housing. Housing is difficult for most Vermonters, regardless of being involved in a criminal legal system. And so how do we really invest in the infrastructure that it would allow us to have fruitful alternatives to incarceration? I would just want to say one thing to this other question, or the next question I saw about, like, who were I'm going to use incarcerated people that were let out, and the types of crimes that lead directly to prison. In Vermont, it's really up to prosecutors. What crime can land you in prison and what crime doesn't. So I'm going to use my own story, for example. I was charged with 2 felonies, one for false pretense and one for uttering a forged instrument, which essentially means that I cashed checks that weren't mine. They were payroll checks that were printed in my name. I didn't do that part. What I did do, though, was, whether it was my choice or not, walk into a bank and cash those checks. And I take full responsibility for it. I'm absolutely guilty for doing that. I was also a person who was in a human trafficking situation. I was a person who was actively using heroin and cocaine. I was a person that had suffered a lot of trauma and abuse in my lifetime, but I did do those things. And so was the solution for me to go to prison? I got a 14-month to 4-year sentence. They knew that I was involved in addiction. They knew that there was all of this trauma and these other circumstances around why I did what I did. And the solution was to incarcerate me, which did nothing to address any of the underlying stuff that led me to that situation. And so in Vermont, it is up to the prosecutor on who goes to jail and who doesn't. In some counties, if you have a retail theft, that can land you there. In other counties, it takes a lot more. And so there is no, okay, it's just these crimes that land you in prison. It depends on the day, who the judge is, who the prosecutor is, which is also problematic. Our state's attorneys in Vermont could effectively change the criminal legal system tomorrow, if they wanted to.
Well, absolutely, and they did. I mean, they proved our point. I mean, we've been saying this for years. You don't need to send so many people to prison. You could use your discretion, state's attorneys, to be more selective. Send fewer people. No, of course not. Just dismissed out of hand across the board. Within a matter of weeks, we saw a 25% reduction in the pretrial detained population. That's people who are incarcerated, accused of a crime awaiting trial. That was the process. Primarily, it was police not arresting people for things that didn't really rise to a certain level, which is another thing that police need to continue not doing. But it was also prosecutors making the decision that they weren't going to send people to prison if it really didn't implicate public safety. And I think Ashley and I would argue that they could have and still could go much further. But that's essentially what they proved that they can do that. We saw a 25% reduction after years and years of failed efforts at bail reform, where the Vermont legislators have been essentially frustrated in their efforts to pass meaningful bail reform. It happened in a matter of weeks because prosecutors were motivated by the public health threat of COVID-19. And as Ashley points out, without any negative impact on public safety. Although even there you have prosecutors such as ours in Washington County saying that it's too soon to draw conclusions. Well, studies are starting to draw conclusions across the country showing that it hasn't had an impact on public safety. So we've safely reduced significantly the number of people in prison. And you're absolutely right, Ashley, to point out the critical role of prosecutors who are up for election in 2022. Unfortunately, they get 4 years, where basically everyone else of consequence in the state gets 2-year terms. But state's attorneys are the most powerful actors in the criminal legal system, and some of the least well-known or roles that are not well-known or understood. And that's been part of our work as well, with Ashley to highlight the critical role that they play in driving mass incarceration.
So I'm Jack Cushman. I'm one of the production team here, and this has been such an interesting conversation. I've heard so many things that I was unaware of, and perhaps the most striking is what we've just been discussing, how within weeks of the pandemic arriving, the jails were starting to empty out and the funnels into the jails were starting to clog up. And I can't help but wonder if we imagine a world in which a vaccine comes around and we all over the place are successfully reopening the economy and reopening the schools. And does that mean we're also going to be reopening the jails?
So I will add that the population has started to creep back up already. So using an example, just because I looked at it this morning. So we have one women's facility in the state of Vermont, and this is true across the board. I just only know this number because, again, I looked at it this morning. At its lowest point, I think in April and May, it got down to 74. So there was only 74 women or people that identify as women in the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, and today it's at 96. And so, and we've seen it across both populations, the entire population start to creep back up, right? Like as things start to open up slowly, we've also seen an increase in the population.
Can I just say, like, similar, like system-wide, it hit a low point of, I think, 1,360 people in around the same time in early May, and now we're up over about 1,415. So it's creeping back up, including and statewide.
So Rob is going to be calling on people who have questions in the chat room, but I do notice that one person who's identified just as iPhone asked a question that had occurred to me as well. So I'll go ahead and ask that one, which is, as the prison population declined early on, did that create capacity in a way in which these poor folks in Mississippi who have been farmed out could be brought into Vermont facilities and perhaps put back into the general population in the way that we've been doing with those who weren't sent to Mississippi? Or did we not do that, or is there some barrier, perceived barrier to reabsorbing these exported folks back into our own care?
Yeah, I mean, Ashley, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe some folks have come back. I don't know the exact number. I believe it's maybe a few dozen folks have come back from Mississippi. But the majority, over 200 people, are still there. And as I said earlier, the vast majority of them have now tested positive for COVID-19. Ashley, do you know the exact number? Or?
So I don't know the exact number, but what I will say is first of all, they have to. So anybody that's approaching their release date has to be shipped back from out of state in order to prepare for reentry. And so that's one piece. It's not optional to bring folks back. So there's constant buses, both going to Mississippi and sort of coming back at different points in a month or every few weeks or however that looks. But that doesn't really stop, because if someone is within a certain time frame of their release date, they have to be brought back to Vermont in order to prepare for release. And so Vermont,
do we continue to transport people down to Mississippi despite the disease situation?
Yes, if you're sentenced to a year or more, the Department of Corrections can ship you out of state. And a lot of their reasoning right now is well, yes, we have less people in Vermont state facilities, but we're also trying to work on social distancing. We need the space to try to be more effective in combating COVID-19. There's a lot of justifications and reasonings that sort of happen for why they want to continue to have a private prison out of state contract. Another piece of that is they will also say, in defense of the reason they hold these private prison contracts, is that Vermont has no maximum security facilities. And so once we sort of debunk this whole population overcrowding piece of the conversation, then we move into, it's a supervision level. So Vermont has no maximum security facilities for anyone. And so we have to ship those people that warrant a higher level of supervision out of state. I was married to someone that got shipped out of state, and that is not the case. They ship folks out of state all of the time that are able to be supervised in Vermont. We house women offenders, incarcerated women of all crime type convictions, including up until, life sentences, in South Burlington, 3 driveways away from Denny's. Like that is also just not a true statement that, like, you have to have a maximum security place to send these folks to, because they're all housed together. They're not put in units that would warrant sort of that type of contract.
Okay, thanks for those answers. I know Scott Weathers is on. He asked a couple questions in the chat, and I know you asked partially one of them, but he has another very good question about alternatives. So Scott, would you want to unmute yourself and ask that question?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think Ashley and James, this is a really fascinating conversation. I think y'all mostly answered my first question, but if there's anything else y'all want to share about that, I'd love to hear it. My second question here, or set of questions, I guess, I'm just curious for your thoughts or just factual information about the ways in which formerly incarcerated folks are hurt after they end their sentence in sort of legal and explicit ways, rather than just, you know, stigma and other things that of course affect incarcerated folks, but sort of the ways that we might be able to change through policy and legislative work. And, you know, one instance that kind of came to mind is whether Vermont disenfranchises people after they are incarcerated. I just don't know the answer to that. And I'm sure there are other ways that formerly incarcerated folks are hurt. And I'd love to hear from you all about that.
Yeah. Well, I can take the first part and then maybe I'll let Ashley take the rest. I mean, I guess that's one piece of good news, is that Vermont does not disenfranchise, unlike many other places. Folks have the right to vote while incarcerated and afterwards, but there are a ton of other collateral consequences, both in terms of, you know, matter of law and policy, and then, you know, as a, you know, more informal and stigma related. But I think I'll let Ashley speak to some of those.
Yeah, I mean, as the formerly incarcerated ED, it's interesting because I can be an executive director of a nonprofit. I can serve in spaces like, I was thankful to the Speaker of the House, who recently appointed me to the Vermont Commission on Women. So I can serve in those roles. But if I go to apply for a job at Big Lots, I am considered a high-risk employee and denied employment. And so it's very interesting how stigma really plays into the conversation. How, you know, while Vermont participated in the Ban the Box initiative, and employers don't ask you anymore if you're convicted of a felony on an application as soon as you get to the interview, right? That's a conversation. And I think that a lot of formerly incarcerated folks are denied employment, are denied housing, are denied chaperoning their kids' field trip, right? Or being able to do volunteer work. Or there's many, many ways in which you don't even necessarily think about. And if we're really honest about Vermont is like one community, right? Like, we're so small. If me and anyone on this call had a conversation, I'm pretty sure if we got to talking about people we know, we'd get to like the fifth person and realize like we're either neighbors or related or something of that nature. And so the reality is, you know, specific to like rural communities and a small community like Vermont, even statewide, like that stigma means more. It means everyone in the grocery store knows, right? We plaster people's mugshots on Twitter. You know, the police in Vermont often do that. We put up these really scary messages across WCAX or NBC about people being released, and it's not even an accurate depiction of the truth. I mean, the ways in which we also just shame and stigmatize and shun folks re-entering our communities with inaccurate information or inaccurate descriptors is also problematic. And so it really can affect you in ways that you don't even expect.
So I'm going to go to Steve Crowley, who's actually in his car right now. And I hope he's in his electric vehicle. Because, by the way, that's a topic of discussion for us on September 30th. But
Yeah.
speaking of neighbors, James Lyall and I are actually backdoor neighbors. So you said how everybody is a neighbor. Well, it's true, even in this conversation. So, Steve, your question, are you driving your EV?
I am driving. Well, I'm actually not at the moment. I'm just sitting in it.
Okay.
But yes, that's where I am. So my question is about reparative or restorative justice. You know, you were talking earlier about getting rid of the system, and I know that, and I was also very impressed by. I read through that sentencing reform bill that was passed, and I was just hugely impressed with the immense amount of work, but it didn't seem to address this issue. You know, and so I guess I wonder if your goal is to shift people out of incarceration systems, that reparative justice, restorative justice would have to be something that's very important and robust. And I don't know what your vision is of that. Do you think that the system as it is can handle this? Does it need reform too?
Okay, so We do have a restorative justice system in Vermont. I would say that oddly, unlike some other places, our restorative justice system is mostly housed inside of corrections. And so, you know, real restorative practices, real, you know, based out of, you know, non-white tribes that we need to give credit to the amazing non-Western people and places that restorative circles and processes come from, we would need an overhaul. We would need to fund them. I mean, there are amazing people that work at our community justice centers that do amazing work regardless of where they're housed. And I think if we also funded them correctly and provided them with the support and training that they also deserve, we could have a much more robust system. I think that there's also a lot of ways in which we don't think about restorative justice in sort of switching it to a transformative justice conversation, which is a little bit of a different lens. And how do we use those principles and practices outside of systems? How do we get away from using systems and start building community accountability, community engagement around restorative practices and processes? So yeah, we would need an overhaul and we would need to fund them correctly.
And just to add to that, if there's any question about, you know, whether we have the resources to do that, we currently spend, the little state of Vermont with our tiny budget spends $500 million a year on public safety, on the punitive model of public safety. If you look at, you know, prisons, police, courts, prosecutors, defense attorneys, the whole thing, that's a lot of resources going to a failed model, a failed system. So there are resources there. It's a question of how we deploy them and whether they're consistent with our values and whether, you know, we're comfortable with the outcomes. But I think all of that counsels in favor of an overhaul, as Ashley is saying.
Okay, so this is a kind of question almost related to that topic about the resources. And it's something I haven't experienced because I've been working on more environmental issues, environmental justice, and not coming into the judiciary. But I've heard members of the BIPOC community complaining about coming in and asking for all these great criminal justice reforms and then being denied by the police officers coming in and testifying in uniform. What is your experiences with that? Is that a situation that you've experienced?
Oh, you want to talk about police reform now? I'm kidding.
Well, it's criminal justice reform, but blocking the criminal justice reform.
It is. No. It's a totally fair question. I'm sort of kidding. Because yeah, I mean, police are at the front end of this whole carceral system that we've been discussing. And obviously there's a lot of attention to policing, the need for police reform, or as we would say, the need to reimagine and transform policing, and divest from policing and redeploy resources. You know, a lot of what we're talking about in the criminal legal system applies to policing. To answer your question, yeah, I mean, part of the reason why you're seeing the massive abuse of power from police, and it's not, that is not new. The attention to it is new. But the reason why it has persisted and grown worse, well, there are a few reasons for it, but one reason is that police have accrued enormous power with no meaningful oversight or accountability, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And they have fought tooth and nail anything approaching even a modest police reform. And you see that from police unions, you see that from rank and file, you see that from police leaders in the state and across the country. And in Vermont, yes, you see modest police reform bills proposed, and police officers come in and pack the room in uniform, but not every legislator is willing to stand up to that. And unfortunately, we saw that right after George Floyd was murdered, and we saw a historic nationwide movement for racial justice and police reform. The first voices and the loudest voices and the most frequent voices in the State House in the weeks following that were law enforcement. Senate GovOps heard twice as much testimony from law enforcement as anybody else. And so, yeah, people of color, Black and brown community members, advocates have all been taking note of this and saying, you know, we're fed up with this, essentially. If you're gonna expect the police to police themselves, you can absolutely expect more of the same. And you can expect, you know, the kinds of protests that we've seen to continue. The hope is that the legislature and policymakers in Vermont, local level, state level, and nationwide start to listen to other voices. And in all of these things, looking to the voices of people directly impacted by an injustice or by a given policy, that is the only way to solve these problems. And that is absolutely true when it comes to policing. So, I mean, I could go on and on about policing, but I will leave it there unless there are other follow-up questions.
I just want to add one thing to what James was saying, and I would also say that part of the reason that you see so much, I'll call it flex, right, of that power from corrections. We saw the same thing in relation to COVID and the misconduct. We see it with police currently, given recent events. It's number one, to deter people, right? It's an intimidation tactic to try to drown out the voices of the directly impacted people, because the reality is that when you speak truth to power, things change. And so you would not show that much force. You would not show up in uniform and pack rooms to drown out Black and brown voices, directly impacted voices, if you were not scared of them speaking truth to people in power above you. And that's the reality. We do it across the board. Our legislature continues, whether it's corrections, police, the Sheriffs and States Attorneys Association, the union, continues to always take more testimony from those folks than the people that they should be listening to and should be most interested in, which are the people directly impacted by the policies that they are hearing testimony on, that they are going to vote on, and that they are going to implement.
So Suzanne asked another question related to restorative justice, but I'm going to do a plug in just for our further community conversation. Suzanne recently joined our volunteer production team to put these on. So if anybody's interested in doing further meetings with us, please contact me about joining our team. But Suzanne, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hey, so I was on the restorative justice in Newport, Vermont, and one of the main reasons I was asked by Barb Morrow, who is absolutely phenomenal, but anyways, I was asked to be on it because she said, you're fair but tough and you have out-of-the-box thinking. I mainly left because a lot of the things were prescriptive, like write a letter to the people you affected, write a letter, an essay about what you did wrong and how you can remedy it, do community service, like for pretty much everything. And so I was just like, how is this really working? And so my question is, across Vermont, I've talked to a few other people and they say, yeah, that's pretty much what we do too. So it's not really restorative or like creative ways when you stick to a prescriptive platform. And what are the numbers? Like what is, I know it's a fairly new thing, but what is the outcome of it? And is it actually beneficial?
So I don't know if you're on for this related question previously, but I mean, I think just to try and echo what Ashley said at that point, there are a lot of different models of restorative justice. There are a lot of tools in the restorative justice toolbox. The system that we have in Vermont does not necessarily implement them all, and not necessarily have the funding and support to implement them all. There are a lot of good people working in that system, working really hard. They don't necessarily have the funding and the support to do everything that they could do. I mean, that is my, not being an expert in restorative justice, that is my take on it. And, Ashley, once again, I would ask if you have, deeper insights than that. But, as with anything, there are different models and there are deeper dives on a strategy of restorative justice that work. But I mean, I hear the concern. I don't think a cookie cutter approach is ever a good approach in any context.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the other ways, if you have the time to say briefly in a nutshell, like the more effective models of restorative justice?
I would say that, first of all, restorative justice is a set of principles, right? There is no cookie cutter for it. And the idea behind, circles and support, and, we have COSA programs here in Vermont. And those are really about putting a team of people around you to say, what do you need, right? So what it takes for me to heal or get to a place of accountability, or address, right, underlying things that may be going on, whether it's mental health or addiction or harm behaviors, whatever that may be. What's going to work for me to heal is not the same thing that's going to work for you. It's not the same thing that's going to work for James or Rob, right? Mm-hmm. And so the point of restorative is just that, to restore. I mean, the action is in the word. And so the idea is, how do we provide a menu of options? How do we ask people what they need to heal and be better and do better and be more and do more, right? That should be our approach. And I think the piece we were talking about earlier is around that takes more funding, right? Cookie cutter approaches come from groups and organizations that are underfunded, that aren't provided more training opportunities, that are provided the leadership to be able to do that for the people they're serving and working with. It's around, sort of this punitive mindset that restorative justice has taken in Vermont. It's simply another, it has become, unfortunately, more of an arm of the system, or an off ramp that's like, okay, if you do it, we'll take time off your sentence, or if you do it, you can, avoid this or that. And it's also, if you do not do the letter and the essay and the community service, like, you're going to go back in front of the judge and you're probably going to jail.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And that's not, we want to foster accountability, right? We want to foster like healing and growth. True justice, like the best definition I've ever heard of justice, is true justice is when all parties involved in an act of harm have an opportunity to heal. The person that was harmed, the person that committed the harm, and the community around them. Mm-hmm. Like, that is the goal. That is the ultimate benefit. And just to also say, like, there are amazing people that work in corrections. There are good people that work all throughout, right? The legal system, the carceral state. They're like good people, but toxic systems are toxic for them as well, right? Yeah. So people trying to do restorative justice, like, if we're not giving them what they need, that's all they can do. For, corrections officers, they have the highest rate of suicide, right? Like, out of any group. If that doesn't tell you how toxic the system is, even for folks that work there, I don't know what else does, right? Like, there is toxicity all through these systems. They don't work for anybody, not the people they're designed to support or supervise, and not even the folks that work there. We are not giving anybody what they need.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That was amazing. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, we're getting close to the end. James, do you have a final statement? And Ashley, would you like to give us a final statement before we end this?
Closing remarks. I think the only thing that I'm duty bound and obligated to say is just, for people who care about these issues, to get engaged and stay engaged. It's the only way that we can change any of this is through the engagement of Vermont residents. You can do that in numerous ways, including by following both of our organizations, by supporting our work, by following the work that we're doing in the State House, by responding to our calls to action when we need help contacting legislators, engaging with local officials, state's attorneys, city government. There's a whole host of ways to be politically engaged, and I think folks in the Sierra Club know that very well. So it's not like I'm telling you anything you don't know, but if you care about this stuff, please join us in the work. And just thanks again for the invitation. It's been a great discussion.
Yeah, and thank you as well for the opportunity. Yes, everything James said, should definitely follow both of our work if you're involved in these issues. I think we're also both like super available to folks through email or other ways too, to have more conversations. I would also say that James gave the higher level pitch. I'm going to give the community level pitch, which is this starts at your dinner table. This starts at the grocery store when you're talking with a friend in the aisle. This starts with your local church group. This starts with the moms you take a walk with, socially distanced in the park lately with your children. These conversations about how we respond to harm differently and how we better support each other happens at home and person to person long before it happens in the legislature. And I would also say that I really appreciate the opportunity to be here in this conversation. I think there's a follow-up conversation to be had about like prison construction and the environment and climate change. Just to throw that in there. And I really appreciate this time tonight.
Good. Thank you very much, James and Ashley. And thanks, Steve, for being on our production team, and Jack and Suzanne, and everybody participating. I just wanted to give you an update of our next couple of conversations that we're going to be doing. And just for that, we're doing these on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock during this time of year. We don't have one scheduled for next week. It's just with the holiday, it's a little challenging to schedule that one, but we are scheduling one for September 16th about climate and agriculture. Maddie Kemper from NOFA, Vermont is going to join us with another guest. Then September 23rd, of forest carbon and achieving Vermont's climate goals. Bill Keaton is going to be the lead presenter on that. And then September 30th is going to be our Vermont EV stories and Drive Electric Week virtual community conversation. And that's what I was talking about with Steve with his electric vehicle. We're going to be capturing stories about people, why they drive electric vehicles, not just the fear people have. But also Dave Roberts from Drive Electric Vermont may be joining us, and we'll be having a contest about who can give us the best little story. But that's why we wanted to have this conversation, hear your stories. So thank you, James and Ashley, for joining us. Good night, everybody. And if everybody wants to see any of our future conversation, you go to sierraclub.org/Vermont. And our upcoming events on there and the recordings from all these conversations are listed up there. So thank you all for participating.